Now that we know a bit about arrays and how we can loop through arrays using a for loop, today we will learn an advanced way of looping through the array using something called a for each loop. Now let's go ahead and create first of all an array, but before that we'll define a variable called size, which will be the size of the array. Now I'll create an integer array of size 5 like this, and now after this let me initialize some elements. For example, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 like this. Now we know the general way of looping through an array, which is by using a for loop. We initialize I to 0 like this, and then we say something like I less than size, this is the condition, and increment I at each iteration. Then we will use a cout like this and say array index I to be able to fetch the element at this specific index. And then this is it. This is how we generally know how to loop through an array using a normal for loop. But what is a for each loop? Well, a for each loop is simply an advanced for loop that is used only to loop through collections. And collections, like for example arrays, and future videos we will learn about template arrays and vectors, but simply we call those elements, like arrays, we call them collections because they store a collection of elements. So a for each loop is used to loop or iterate through a collection of elements. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to build a for each loop. Let me go ahead and delete this. And what I'll do first of all is I'll say for like this. Well, for like this. It's simple for, but this time what differs is the content of the for loop. What you'll do is you'll initialize I, but you won't give it any value. What you'll do is you'll add this call it and specify the collection you want to iterate through. And this is a for each loop. So you specify the initializer or the declaration if you want, and then you specify here the collection that you want to iterate through. Now here let's go ahead and say cout I like this, and I'll put this space right here, and let me put end L right here. And now I run the code. As you can see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this actually works properly. But what's happening here? Well, basically, I right here, at each iteration, it will store the elements of the array, meaning that the for loop will loop or iterate through the array, and I right here is a variable that will store at each iteration a value from the array. It will store at first 1, and then at the next iteration it will store 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. Okay, that's why here we used I as the one to print the elements of the array. So this is a for each loop. It is very simple to use. Now let's go ahead and learn about the reference operator that you can use inside a for each loop. Now, watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to add the reference operator right here. If you remember this video about pass by value and pass by reference, you'll definitely know what I mean by here, but either way I'm going to explain. First of all, the for loop, or the for each loop, excuse me, when it wants to iterate through an array, what it will do is that it will create a copy of each of these elements and print the element, okay? So if I didn't have this reference operator right here, what will happen is that by default each element of this array will get a copy. Okay, so it will get a copy and then we won't work with the original value. When you add a reference operator right here, what it will do is that it tells the for loop, or the for each loop again, to not create a copy of the value of the arrays, rather to work with the original values of the arrays. So instead of again creating a copy and working with the copy of the original value, what it will do is that it will work with the original value in memory. Now, why is this more efficient than not putting this right here? Well, basically because again, this one creates a copy of the original value and this actually uses more space. Now, because we're building here a small application, so it won't have any effect right now. But when you are building more bigger and scalable applications, you'll definitely need to use a reference operator in order to minimize the space taken by the program, okay? And so this is something you need to keep in mind when you want to work with for each loop. Alright, now a simple exercise to do. Let's go ahead and find the sum and the average of the array. I'll declare a sum variable and initialize it to 0. And then I'll declare a average variable and initialize it to 0 also. After this, let us use a for each loop to loop through the array and find the sum of its elements. So I'll say for like this, and inside what I'm going to say is int, and mention the reference operator to not create a copy of the elements. Then I'll say I like this, and I'll say array like this. Now what I'm going to do is that I need to find the sum. So what I'm going to do is say sum plus equal to I. So because I stores the original values of the array, it is reasonable for me to actually add it with the sum variable right here, which in the end it will give me the sum of all of these values. Now, After getting the sum, let's go ahead and print it. So I'll say sum of array, for example, and it will be sum like this. Okay, now let's find the average. So to find the average is very simple. I'll write average here. This is the variable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to divide sum with size, because if you want to find the average of an array, you need to multiply the sum of all the elements inside the array by the number of elements that is inside the array. So because we have 5 elements and size represents how many elements there is in an array, so it is reasonable for me to actually divide sum with size. And this is it. This is pretty simple. Now we could go ahead and say cout like this and say average of array like this and say avj, which represents the average. And this is it. So let's go ahead and clear the interface first of all, and then compile and launch. And there you have it. Sum is 15 and average is 3. So there it is. There is our simple exercise to do about for each loop in C++. Alright, this is it about the for each loop in C++. It is used again to iterate through a collection just like an array. Now in future videos we will learn about template arrays and vectors, and we will definitely be using the for each loop. Anyways, thank you for watching today's video. Make sure to subscribe to stay up to date for the next C++ tutorial video.